So this is part 4 of my sort of Lego Bionicle battle deep dive. It's a really kind of insane series that I sort of hyper fixated on. I'm really enjoying it though. I'm loving the reception from you guys as well and how much I have been able to just stir up memories for you guys. I've heard so many good things in the comments, so thank you all so much for that. But in this video, we are specifically focusing all of our attention on Turaga weapons specifically. I know I touched on these briefly in a previous video, but we're going much more in depth in this video, talking about their strengths and their weaknesses, and I measure them against basically 4 different stats: the weight of the weapon, the center of mass of that weapon, the overall range of that weapon, not just the weapon itself, but also taking into account who wields that weapon, and of course, overhangs. That one's a little bit hard to explain. Well, it's kind of easy to explain, and we'll get to that one here in a moment. As you guys may know, all the way back in 2001, Bionicle introduced us not only to a handful of Toa sets, but they also introduced us to these 6 Turaga here. And what's really fascinating about these sets is that all of them contain a staff-like weapon. That's a really good way to tell a story with these characters, by the way. You pretty much instantly know that they are sort of the village elder type role, in the sense that they carry these staffs because those staffs sort of imply that they are older characters, that they're like walking sticks. But also, what's fascinating about the fact that these have staves is that staves greatly increase the range of their honestly kind of pitiful range otherwise. Without a staff-like weapon, these do next to no impact damage at all. I mean, put your finger under here and try to feel how hard that hits. It's not that exciting. But when you start to add a staff into the mix, suddenly that impact damage is not only amplified by the distance from the point at which this strikes to the pivot point, right? But also on top of that, the overall range of that weapon is extended, right? Where this moves from this position here to this position here, like maybe an inch, this moves from this position here all the way over here. That's like what, 4 inches, 4 inches, somewhere in there, eyeballing it. So it does a lot of good. But on top of all of that, what is interesting about stabs, one other unique thing that they have, and it's an interesting trade-off, is actually a lack of mass. What do I mean by this? Well, a weapon that is this size is going to weigh less than a weapon like, say, maybe Stronius's club, if you're familiar with that character. Mostly because that club is enormous. If that was shrunk down to this length here, because I don't have it in my hand right now, I can't compare it, it's a much broader, bulkier weapon. It's just gonna weigh more than this. Obviously, there's other parts involved with making that a weapon as well, because it's multiple pieces, but just ignoring all of that for a moment. What this does is it removes the mass from this shaft here, which does a couple of things. First off, it allows you to display the character with it holding the staff, honestly, wherever you think looks the most natural, and that's cool. It's nice to have options, right? But on top of that, by reducing that weight, you do 2 things. You concentrate the center of mass further up the head, or the shaft of the weapon, right? And so the center of mass ends up being much higher, but also because you're going to deal more damage towards the tip of the weapon anyway because of that swing distance, because of that impact distance, it's going to help to even further amplify the impact damage of that weapon. So I went out of my way to measure where the center of mass of each of these weapons was. I did do so with a fairly simple strategy, because there are many different ways to find the center of mass, the center of gravity of an object. And for the sake of this video, we're just going to talk about center of gravity because it's roughly the same thing. We're all measuring it on Earth at the end of the day anyway. And, not much is changing, right? But in these cases here, what I chose to do is just measure balance, putting them on an edge and then pushing them until the point where they fall off, essentially. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's as close as it needs to be. And of course, it doesn't need to be perfect. This just needs to give me a close idea as to where the center of mass is on each of these weapons. And you might be surprised because some of these weapons do not have the center of mass in the head where you think it would be. Why is that important? Well, the center of mass is essentially roughly where you want to contact the item you're trying to knock off, right? So if I am swinging at a mask with an item, I roughly want to hit around where the center of mass is. At a certain point, going past that center of mass, you're getting diminishing returns, right? And any lower than that, you're actually losing impact. Now, obviously, there are ways to sway this, and again, the length of the item that you're swinging is going to matter, because it's still better to hit above that point than below that point, but roughly around that point is the best case scenario if you want to deal the overall maximum impact of the item. That said, this doesn't exist in a vacuum, though. Obviously, the characters have an entire arm that swings too, and that influences the center of mass slightly, but we're just going to ignore that for the sake of this video, because the change is going to be minimal, and for 4 of the 6 characters, they have the same length of arm, so it's roughly going to cancel out, but you get the point I'm trying to get at, right? With that said, though, what else is interesting about the stabs from the Turaga sets is that they're not all the same length, and it would have been very easy for LEGO to make them the same length. For example, when you take a look at these 2 stabs here, these I would call the same length overall, right? Maybe there's a half or quarter millimeter dip, whatever, right? But for the sake of this video, that's close enough. However, a weapon like this, for example, is substantially shorter. And then when we take a look at a weapon like the Cow Staff, it's even slightly shorter still. The difference between 2 weapons like this, though, is for one, the Cow Staff from my measurements weighed the most. It's all within between 2 and 2.5 grams, so the difference here is extremely minimal. But when you talk about a mask that weighs like 2 grams, it does matter, right? That said, though, what these trade off is their range, right? So a weapon like this concentrates a lot of its mass in a relatively small area, because most of that mass is in this area here, whereas a weapon like this ends up spreading that mass out over a larger area. In this case here, the center of mass on this is actually right about this point here, right about where that pinhole is. So that's a good visual indication where it is. This one, not as visual. It's right around the area where this first rung is on the sort of, I don't know, this detail here. What else can I call it, right? And so again, there are differences between some of these characters, but what I find interesting is when you look at weapons like this, the center of mass is actually roughly right around this point here. There is a mold mark there too, which I find fun. It's slightly above that point where the center of mass is, but it's close enough for the sake of a video like this. So when you look at these 2 weapons, then you might think, okay, so this one is going to have probably better overall chance of removing a mask because of that heavier weight, right? Because these 2 weapons are the same length, so this just generally is going to have more impact. And that's true in a vacuum until you look at the characters that wield them, right? Matau wields the Cow Staff, which is what this is called, by the way, fun fact, while Nokama wields the trident. And look at the length of their arms. Nokama's arm is 2 modules longer than Matau's, meaning that the range of this weapon is roughly 2 modules more. It's not actually exactly 2 modules more because it's, trigonometry is weird, but close enough for the sake of the video, right? And so instead of this weapon essentially behaving like it's this short, it actually behaves about the same as one of these staffs if it's being wielded by Nokama, right? So that's interesting. However, this is where another principle comes in. So first off, the heaviest weapons that I measured were the Cow Staff and the drill. I find it funny too that these are wielded by the 2 shortest characters, which technically means the range could be less, assuming the characters are going to be on the ground when they're fighting. Actually, no, the legs are the same length. Just kidding. Doesn't affect the range. It does affect how they hit masks, but that's a different topic. Anyway, but the difference between a weapon like this and this is that this weapon has overhangs where this one does not. What does that mean? So if I take a character like Vakama here, and let me go ahead and get this little visual off the screen for a moment. If I swing this weapon at Nokama downward, because that is the motion of these arms here, right? There's really no point at which this contacts the back of the mask and can grip it, can hook onto it. However, with the Cow Staff, there are several, because these teeth angle downward, they overhang. And so because of that, when it swings, there is a probability that it's going to hook and continue that swing downward, pulling that mask off. It's slight here because the angle of those teeth is not optimal for this, and also you have this kind of big chunk of plastic here that can actually deflect some of that. So when you then look at other weapons with overhangs like this one here, which is very obvious and very good in terms of hooking onto masks and potentially removing them, but the trade-off is that this is the lightest weapon that I measured, and you take a look at this weapon here, which also has one overhang and a pretty blunt surface, so a better sense of accuracy since you've got a slightly larger area to hit. This one also trades off that overhang for mass. This was the second lightest weapon that I weighed. So with all of that in mind, you have to ask, well then, which character has the strongest weapon? And in this case here, I think it roughly cancels out. There are obviously going to be some scenarios where a character is going to deliver a better impact or whatever the case may be. And you might even bring up weapons like this, one of the heaviest ones, and say, well, it has all these knobs all over it, so it surely has overhangs that can grab weapons or grab masks, right? And kind of, but it kind of falls into the same problem as the Turaga Staff in that none of these angle downward. They don't grab onto a mask and pull. They kind of hit a mask and you just hope they hit at the right angle to pull. It's possible to do it, but it's much more difficult than something like this, which is a near guarantee that it's going to grip a mask because it just kind of falls into position every time. Literally each time that I've swung this down when I haven't missed the mask, it is hooked in, right? That's pretty convincing, compelling information there. So what I really love about these weapons is that there is no weapon that is super heavy with a lot of range, has a really well-balanced center of mass, right? And has a bunch of overhangs all at once, and also, you know, has increased accuracy because it's broader. They all sort of trade these features off. And I found the same true with the Toamata weapons as well. Like I said, it's most likely that Liwa's axe is going to knock a mask off in ideal conditions. Yeah, I spoiled that video here, sure. And there's another one I think you'll find kind of interesting if you watch that video, by the way, so make sure you do so. The trade-off with that weapon is that it has much lower accuracy than any of the other weapons because it has a fairly small area you need to hit in order for that mask to transfer most of its energy. There's also, you know, other principles that are going to affect this, like material deflection and all kinds of stuff. Like engineering of this stuff is kind of difficult and you can't get into all the nitty-gritty details, but at the very least, it's worth testing. It's a lot of fun to take a look at, and we have to understand that if we go into our little mind palace for a moment, if we go into our little Back to the Future, you know, time machine or whatever, travel all the way back to 2001, that this game was really compelling and it existed in an era where Pokemon mania was insane, right? The late 1990s into the early 2000s, like Pokemon was everywhere. And so these were, in a way, kind of Lego's answer to Pokemon. Not just a strategy to try and, you know, continue to be successful and not go bankrupt, but also the masks are collectible and tradable like Pokemon cards, and the characters can battle each other like Pokemon cards. In a nutshell, that's really all you need. And yes, I know that Bionicle has a trading card game too. Maybe I'll cover that in a separate video. I've never played it, so it would be fun to do in a video. But with all of that being said, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, my name is Skybird, like I said. And of course, you can join the family here by leaving a like and subscribing. It also really helps out the channel. It's the best way you can, and it gets us that much closer to 3,000 subscribers. If everybody that watched my video subscribed right now, we would have over 10,000 subscribers. It's insane to think about. I had to do analytics stuff yesterday for my sister, who also has a YouTube channel, by the way. I'll plug her in the next one, I guess. With all of that said, too, you can go ahead and check out the links in the description below if you want to see the Discord, the Instagram, or Patreon if you want to help support the channel and videos like this. And I guess I'll link my sister's YouTube channel and my nephew's YouTube channel, too. They both do some pretty awesome stuff. I think you'll enjoy those as well. She just started hers and she's doing pretty well already. I'm really happy for them both too. And on top of all of that, you can take the conversation further down in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts on these weapons and just generally about memories. Talk about memories. What do you remember most about your first wave of Bionicle sets? All right, that's it, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.